this is Sean Hall. I'm here with the Veterans History Project, a part of the Veterans Breakfast Club. I am the Director of Programming with the VBC. I am excited to sit down with Roger Rickert today to hear his story for the Veterans History Project. Roger, I appreciate you joining us and agreeing to share your story of your service in Vietnam. Thank you so much. How are you doing today?
I'm just fine. I have watched so many of these on YouTube, so many stories. Wow, wow, some of them will just blow you away.
Well, certainly yours is up there as well. You sent us a wonderful memoir that whenever we post this video, we will include a link. People will be able to read, but we wanted to dive into your story. And we'll start really with your early life because you have such a very interesting story throughout. Why don't we start there? Tell us a bit about where you're from in your early home life.
I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin until I was 16 years old. I have two sisters, two brothers. My parents are both passed away. My dad would be 103 years old if he was alive. I really was what you call a juvenile delinquent. I didn't have any friends, so I used to shoplift and give people stuff that I shoplifted, thinking if I did that, they would like me. And I hated school, so I didn't go to school. And I ended up standing in front of a judge with my mother, and I was 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And the judge said, "Mrs. Rickert, I think the best thing for your son, Roger, is going to be to join the military. Otherwise, he's going to end up in a juvenile delinquent home where a record will follow him for the rest of his life." Mm-hmm. And that's not a good deal. I'm really glad that he did that. I'm so glad because the military helped me straighten out my life.
Do you think there was a reason why you were a juvenile delinquent? Is there something that sort of led you down this path of just sort of acting against the laws and rules?
I think it was the people, the friends that I hung around with. Mm-hmm. I think that had something to do with it. I think I was a loner, other than the couple of friends that I did have that were a bad influence on me.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that you were a loner because the military is very much not about being a loner. You have to be a team player. As you got into basic, was that a big culture shock for you, just learning how to work as a team and what you needed to do to survive and succeed?
It was you can call it a shock, but I think it was so good because I never experienced that before. Being among friends, depending on them and they depending on you. So I think I lost a lot of that loner thing in the military and basic training, but more so in AIT, Vietnam, and the rest of my military career.
And I might be getting ahead of myself just a touch because I also want to touch on the fact that your father was a World War II vet. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what did he serve? What branch?
He was in the Army. Never said too much about his service. Mm-hmm. He did say that I think he signed up for me to go into the military quite quick because I would have been out of the house and he wouldn't have to worry about me anymore. But he was in World War II. Didn't talk much about his military service, but didn't talk much about mine either. When I came back from Vietnam, mm-hmm. All he could tell me was that we were drug addicts, baby killers, didn't have any real knowledge of what I did there. And a couple of times I just wanted to yell out, "Dad, you were in the quartermaster. I was in the infantry." I've since changed my mind on that because I think his career or his Army story is just as important as mine. He served, he did what he was supposed to do. So I think it was equal. We kind of left it at that, although towards the end I did get him every Memorial Day to go down to the lakefront in Milwaukee and visit the Vietnam Memorial. I bought him a brick with his name on it, so he used to occupy himself when we got there while I sat and reminisced. He would look for his brick, and I used to laugh at that.
What was your relationship with your father like growing up?
Oh, terrible.
Yeah.
Things like, you ain't worth the powder to blow to hell. And that's 60 some years ago, and I still remember that. So I think he may have been one of the reasons I left to go into the military when they told me that was the best thing for me, because I think it was.
Did he have any particular thoughts or opinions on Vietnam as you enlisted? Was would you call that, if a judge says you have to go into the military, is that an enlistment or is that a draft? How would you define that?
That was enlisted.
Enlisted. So did he have any thoughts on the Vietnam War or you going into the Army?
Not at all. I think he was happy with it because it got me, the troublemaker, out of the house.
And what did your mom think?
I didn't want her, because I was 17 and I had to have somebody sign for me.
Yeah.
And I didn't want her because she knew about Vietnam. If my dad knew, he never said anything. But I thought, I'm going to get the quickest signature by going to him. And I did, and he signed it.
And about your brothers and sisters, where are you at in the order, and what did they think of you enlisting?
I'm the second oldest. My youngest brother, and just a few months ago, said, I have the utmost respect for you for doing what you did. He said, I wanted to go in the Army too, but he never said why he didn't. He just said, I wanted to go in the Army.
And you actually you couldn't go straight in. You had to have some surgery to correct something. Is that right?
Correct. I went down to the recruiter and time for the physical, and I had what then was noted as crossed eyes. And they wouldn't take me, said I had to have surgery first. So I went back home, and I told my mom that I'm going to need some surgery, and she told my dad. He had insurance, so I went, I think November 22nd, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the hospital, in the bed, just had my surgery. Shortly after that, I went back to the recruiter. I passed the physical. And then on January 31st, New Year's Eve of 1963, I joined the military.
It was December 31st?
I'm sorry, December 31st. Yeah, New Year's Eve. And I couldn't think of a better way to start a new life for myself.
Yeah, new year, new you. That's how they say it? Talk to me about those first couple days. You get into basic, and what were those first couple days like?
Very hard, very, very hard. Again, I'm a loner. I don't have any friends. I have one friend who went in under the buddy system with me. And back then, I don't know if they do it today anymore, but back then, if you had a friend or a buddy, he could join with you, stay with you for your term service, and go to the different units with you. And his name was George Marinich. So at least I had him to talk to. Other than that, I didn't have anybody.
You talk a bit about in your memoir. You do talk about George a decent amount. So you were pretty close with him.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us about him? What sort of brought you two together? Why did for someone who's a loner, how did you really become friends with George?
We went to the recruiter, and I met this I met this guy there, and his name was George, and we just got to talking, and we both said to each other, "Why not go in under the buddy plan?"
Okay.
And that's what we did. That's how I met him. But he was able, the first couple, 3-4 weeks of basic training, I was able to sit down, talk to him, have coffee with them, and then slow but sure, we got to meet some other people, some other folks like James Trent. He ended up being a good friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a couple of more that I was friends with.
Did you always want to be infantry rifleman, or what was your MOS?
It was 11B.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't my real interest, but I knew that's what I was going to get.
What was your interest?
I thought, something to do with computers, technical stuff, like the Air Force or the Navy.
Mm-hmm. So were you disappointed when you got infantry rifleman?
No, I don't think I was disappointed because it was a new beginning for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was away from home and I had a purpose.
Did you always know you were going to Vietnam?
Pretty much, yes.
Mm-hmm. Was the thought of that scary?
For me, no. For most of my friends that I went to grade school with, several of them joined the military and went off on their own, Marines and that.
Something you wrote in your memoir is you kept referencing this man's army, and you said your question that kept coming up in your mind was, am I a man in the man's army, or am I a teenager that should be home in a classroom? Was that something developmentally you just didn't feel like you fit in, or did you feel like you just weren't sort of an adult yet, a man ready to go to combat?
Yeah, I didn't think George and I were both on the train, and I thought, what am I doing? Do I really want to do this? As we waved goodbye to our parents through the train windows, I could have jumped off that plane and that train and have been done with it. But I followed George, and George stayed along, so I followed him.
Were you with George whenever you shipped off to Vietnam?
Yes.
So was it the night before you shipped out, there was a riot in the barracks that you were a part of?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, everyone went through the billets and got as much beer and alcohol as they could. And they were all drunk, and they started to break the faucets off the sinks in the latrine and got really, really rowdy. Mm-hmm. And one of the guys, desperate as he was, got some bread, a loaf of bread and some aftershave lotion, and strained that through the bread because it still had some alcohol in it. Mm-hmm. After we broke windows and everything, they finally called the military police. And the military police came down, weapons drawn, and they babysat us until we got on a plane and out of there the next day.
So you were part of this sort of mini riot?
Yes.
Did you suffer any consequences for it?
No, none at all. Because we were going to Vietnam. What were they going to do?
That's true. What are you going to do? Send us to Vietnam? I guess you still had a bit of that sort of mischievous streak in you then, still at that point.
Yes.
Yeah. So you are on the way over to Vietnam. Where is George through this? Is he with you on the plane?
He's with me on the plane. We flew to California. I think the 3 days after we flew there, they did our records check and everything, and we boarded a boat called the USS Gordon. Mm-hmm. And just as we crossed under the San Francisco Bridge. Brigade commander came back on and said, "We're going to Vietnam. That's our mission." All before that, they kept saying, "Well, maybe we were going to go to Hawaii because the 25th Division was going to go to Vietnam and we were going to replace them." Well, I guess we all knew that wasn't true. So under the bridge is when we finally got confirmation where we were going.
What year was this?
1965.
So this
July.
is relatively early in the Vietnam War?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think it was yesterday that our ship sailed out.
June 25th?
Yeah.
So what phase would you say the war was in at this point? Was it popular at that time, 65?
There weren't a lot of protests.
Mm-hmm.
I think the people back home supported us. I think they did that until body bags kept coming home and they just got tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when it started. I don't think early 65.
Yeah. Did you feel ready? Did you feel like basic prepped you well enough to head over to Vietnam? And were you nervous at all as you pulled into Vietnam?
Nervous, scared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of them may not admit it, but most of them were. We landed in Cam Ranh Bay, and Cam Ranh Bay today is the biggest pier in the military.
Mm-hmm.
So there was nothing there. There were just sand hills, some Vietnamese. So we started out with making our own roads. We would drive diesel trucks around, spilling diesel all over what was going to be our roads. Mm-hmm. We started to do that. We lived in tents in the sand. I don't think we had any military contact right off the start. I don't think that came until we went to Benoit, and that was our new area of operation.
So how long were you in country until you went to Benoit?
Month and a half.
About a month and a half. Can you tell me about the first time you got off the boat? What was your first impression of Vietnam?
Everybody was joking and kidding around, laughing. So we were all doing it. So I don't think I was a loner anymore.
Yeah.
And we all got off the boat with our weapons on our shoulders, and we couldn't carry any ammunition. So that told me right away that it was a pretty safe area. Mm-hmm. I don't think we got ammunition for our weapons until 4 or 5 days later.
At what point did the war become real to you? Was it stepping off the boat, or was it first time in combat, or
first time in combat?
Can you tell me about that?
There were 3 or 4 of us, and I think this is the reason why I've been suffering for the last 50-some years. We were on a patrol. There were 3 or 4 of us. We heard a noise to our left flank, and we knew our unit wasn't on the left side. Mm-hmm. So the 3 or 4 of us in my team opened fire. Sounds like I've never heard before. So much firing. And then we stopped and we started to walk to that left flank. And we found this young Vietnamese kid. And by kid, I mean he was probably the same age as I was. Mm-hmm. Washington was terrible at that time. They didn't believe my unit for head count. We used to be able to just call in the head count. Now they wanted us to bring them the bodies. So 3 or 4 of us put this kid in a poncho and we carried them for seemed like 2 days to a pickup zone by helicopter.
Mhm.
And when we got there, we were exhausted, and we threw the poncho on the ground, and I saw hundreds of maggots and ants and flies buzzing around this kid's brain because he only had half a head.
Mhm.
But he had one eye that was, to me, it looked like it was staring straight at me. And I think that's when my whole PTS started.
After having done 2 tours in Vietnam and you go through multiple combat situations, does something like that, does something like seeing the costs of war like that, does that become commonplace eventually? It's something that the first time you see it, I'm sure was so jarring. And as you said, sort of developed a PTS response. But does that become easier over the course of being there for two tours?
Well, I think some of it does. I there was the normal KIAs, both friendly and enemy.
Mm-hmm.
It was nothing like what I saw that day. Our unit was out on a nightly ambush, and they went out before dark to set up the Claymore mines and everything, and just sat in the ambush waiting. Along came 3 or 4 Vietnamese, and our unit opened fire. And in Vietnam, in training, they always told us in an ambush, you go forward and you check for KIAs, prisoners, paper, maps, that kind of weapons, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in training, I can tell you that. In Vietnam, we never did that. As soon as we sprung the ambush, we ran through it and started back for our unit, because I think we were just as scared as they were. When my unit did get back into the wires, I heard a moaning, and that moan lasted all night long. Mm-hmm. And I knew that could only mean one thing. They left their brother there, and he was dying. The next day, we got up and we started on our 10,000 meter patrol again. We ran into his body. And what surprised me is there was no weapon there. There was no ammunition there. So my thoughts is his unit must have gone through there, picked all of that up, and just left him there to die. And I thought, he's not a gook, he's not a slope, he's not a slant-eyed. He's a soldier like me who was just doing what he was supposed to be doing. And he'll never have the chance to go home and meet with his parents and loved ones. And that made me kind of feel bad. I think it changed my feeling about the Vietnamese.
It's interesting you say that. I want to come back to that, changing the feeling about the Vietnamese, but let's go back to the young boy the sort of first incident you had in combat. Couple questions about that. How did you feel coming out of that first experience in combat? Did you feel more confident? Did you feel more nervous? How did you respond to that first engagement?
The next time, what the Viet Cong would do is we'd be going through like the Michelin rubber plantation, mm-hmm. and they would fire at us and then climb into their tunnels, put wood and weeds and stuff back on the tunnel, and they were gone. Mm-hmm. So the first time that happened, I couldn't get far enough in that ground. All I heard was bullets whizzing past my head. And I cried that day, and I said to to the Lord, and Lord, if you get me through this year, I promise I won't be a juvenile delinquent anymore.
Mhm.
So it was, any firefight was scary. I don't think I ever got used to it. It was something very scary.
So you mentioned that out of that first firefight, that's when the war really became real to you.
Yes.
How far into your tour was that first experience in combat?
3 months, I think. 3-4 months.
And in going over to Vietnam and then sort of engaging and starting your tour, before you got there, I'm sure you were prepped for what the Vietnamese were like, what the NVA and the Viet Cong were like, trained for that. Did you feel any animosity towards Vietnamese soldiers? Were you prepped with sort of anger towards them?
I think we were, because they were there to do what we were there to do, and that was to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think the animosity came from. But it was this young kid with half the head who helped me change my mind on that.
So you go out on night patrols. What were night patrols like for you?
Scary. I think we were all scared. It was night, and we were
Pitch
moving.
black?
It was dark.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that jungle, the only way we could move would be if we put our hand on the soldier's backpack in front of us and made like a train. And that's how we would get through that jungle.
Just
So it was,
almost like hand in hand, just
yeah,
as
it was
close.
it was scary because you didn't know what, it was dark. You didn't know what was coming on or going on.
Mm-hmm. I think the question I was going to get to before was, you had entered, you enlisted around 16, knew about Vietnam, but what were your thoughts before entering the Army, and how did those thoughts change? And I'd like to get to the idea of, having been through that one experience, you changed your mind on the Vietnamese, but what were your thoughts on them prior to entering the military?
All we did was, again, any of my friends, I talk about him a little later. I had a friend who was in grade school with me, and we were 9. I think he was in 9th grade at the time, and his parents owned a bar. So we would go downstairs and we would party down there. And that's all you heard is, I'm going to kill me a gook. I'm going to kill me a slant-eyed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was me part of that was me also.
Mm-hmm. And then you go through this experience that sort of changed your mind. You saw another kid who was your age who had been killed. That changed your mind very early in your first tour, but you continued on with that tour. You even had a second tour. Was there now a sort of understanding, maybe a mutual respect for the enemy?
I think it's a mutual respect that I had. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We lost a lot of people there. So, they were very good. They were trained. The jungle was their life.
Yeah.
That was their home. And we were all new to that atmosphere.
And you were stationed in Benoit, right?
Yes.
Can you tell me about your living conditions there? What was it like being on that base?
We all slept in a tent, a big tent, probably 25, 30 guys maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we lived. And then another part is when you were out on a mission and you came back in, we didn't know what we were going to do. We're not shooting, we're not running, we're not scared. The adrenaline isn't flowing.
Mhm.
So they thought, well, let's give them a break and put them on a truck and take them to the town of Benoit. And they did that one day. Everyone showered up and put their smelly stuff on. And they were going to the bars in Benoit. And the bars were called New York, Texas, Wisconsin. And it was kind of funny. But we went into the bars, and Mama-san would be standing outside, and she couldn't say anything about having intercourse. They called it boom boom. So Mama-san said, boom boom, $3, $5 with beer. They couldn't say it because then our unit would have banned their place of business. We wouldn't be able to go there anymore. So I didn't participate in that, and I didn't because I thought I had a faithful partner waiting back home. And I didn't want to come out of that. And they used to call it being sloppy tens, which meant, so many guys on a girl.
Yeah.
So I didn't participate in it.
So you had a wife or a girlfriend at home?
Girlfriend.
Girlfriend. So about a pretty serious girlfriend before you left.
Yes.
You talk a bit about this in your memoir as well. But how long were you with her before you were shipped out?
Yeah, I actually married her in December of 1963. I met her when she was 15. So we got married very young. And then I shipped out, and the Dear John letter comes along, and that comes because what I think the reason it comes is because she was pregnant and had a miscarriage and wanted me to come home. And it's Vietnam, the military wasn't going to do that. So I didn't get the chance to go home. Before that, we lived above my parents, and my wife's letters became fewer and fewer, down to maybe one a week, and I knew something was going on. So I asked my mom if she could find out what's going on, because my wife lived upstairs. So my mom finally wrote back and said, Jackie goes out a lot at night with her girlfriends, sometimes with the girls and the guys. So I knew what was coming. And eventually, she wrote me a letter, said she fell in love with the mailman. October of that year was my birthday. And surprisingly, she sent me that picture that's in that journal now, in that memoir now. And I think it was a 14 by 14 picture. Because when I got home, I asked her if we could sit down and talk. And she said, no, I'm pretty serious about this guy. And she said, so serious, do you know that picture I sent you? And I said, yeah. And she said, he helped me pick out the best one. So I knew it was over then. So I just got up, left the picture on the steps. And I think it was midwinter, maybe. It seemed very cold. And I just walked home.
When you were deployed and going through this, it's difficult enough, I'm sure, to deal with combat situations and the stresses of war, and you're leaning on the friends around you. You're leaning on the letters that you're receiving. How difficult was it to emotionally have to go through something with your significant other while you're dealing with combat and the military and the Vietnam War?
Very. Although we would support our brothers. When someone got a Dear John letter, we'd all sit down if we could, and we were back in the units, because that's where we got most of our mail call. We'd sit down and try to talk to them and support them, and bring out a bottle and have a shot, and then 2 shots, and then 3.
Yeah.
And we kind of helped them ease their way through that.
Take me through sort of the day by day. This is, I mean, it's a long tour. It's a year long. You know, you switched up. You're in Benoit, but what was the day by day like? You get up. You know, it's very different than life here at home.
We get up, have chow, and every day we would walk. The normal would be 10,000 meters. And then we'd plow through the jungles. And then we'd set up at night with our ponchos, have chow, and go to sleep. Next day, same thing. If you didn't have combat, or if you didn't have an engagement, you did the same thing. You walked for 10,000 meters, you stopped, and you set up, and you went to sleep. There were times that those 10,000 meters, we would come across VC weapons caches where they had buried weapons and mines and rockets. And we would have to get all those. And again, we'd have to send it back to our unit. And they would send them to higher headquarters to see what we had captured. We did a lot of that. We've seen a lot of that. They would send us out on, which I don't know that I fully agree today, but they would send us out on search and destroy missions.
Mm-hmm.
If we came across the village, they would drop flyers from helicopters, telling the people we were coming through that village tomorrow. So what did they think was going to happen? All of the men VC were gone. And when we went into that village, there was nothing but women and children.
Right.
Still, they gave us the order to burn it down, so we burnt it to the ground. There were animals in some of these hooches, and they would just open up the hatch and just kill that animal. And then we'd move on. And again, we'd have another search and destroy maybe a week or two later. But we did a lot of that destruction.
And what did you think of that, especially the first time you had to go on that?
I thought, well, I was mad at our government, because I don't think you drop flyers announcing that you're coming. Mm-hmm. What did they think the men were going to do? They were going to get out of that village, and then they were going to come back that night, and they would be the ones that were going to ambush us the next day. You couldn't trust a VC because they all looked the same, they dressed the same. There were no rules of engagement for them. You know, if we found them, we don't kill them. We take them back to the units.
What year did you leave Vietnam after that first tour?
July of 1966.
And that when that tour was done, is that understanding service at that time? Did that mean that you were done out of the Army? You didn't need to go back, or what was your service record at that point?
I had to go. I think I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, for just a few months, and then I was discharged.
What was it like coming home after that first tour?
Terrible. On the airplane, I can remember all of us taking off our uniforms and throwing them in the trash barrel on the plane.
And this was in 66.
Yeah.
Wow.
Later 66, because we knew protesters were going to be at the airport, so they told us to take it off. And they were going to treat us to a steak dinner, but we all said, no, let's just get the hell out of here and go home. And so we did. So I got home, and you had your close relatives, mother, father, sisters, brothers, who welcomed you home. I can remember my mom was throwing a little party for me on a Sunday in the afternoon, and I had my khaki uniform on, and I I went into a tavern to get a pack of cigarettes, and the bartender told me to get the fuck out. I wasn't welcome there. So I did. I got out and left. Most Vietnam veterans didn't talk about Vietnam for a long, long time. Why didn't I? Because in 1972, I went to VA and I said, I've got a problem. I'm depressed. I feel alone. I feel alone in a crowd. And they said to me at that time that we don't think it's really part of your military service. And even if it is, it'll go away in a while. And that was 26 years before I went back to the VA.
Yeah.
We didn't have anyone to talk to, so we formed our own vet centers, and today it's approved by VA, and VA supports it. But we did that. And they would go to Washington to the memorial, and just to be with their friends. And that's what it was. It was hard. It was hard.
How do you think that first tour changed you as a person? So you went in sort of juvenile delinquent, started to understand the military, said it was good for you. You made friends, you lost a wife through a Dear John letter. There was a lot of growth and a lot of growing up in that first year. But can you define for me how you were when you came back after that first tour?
Well, I kept my promise when I dug myself into the dirt and promised God if I could live that year, I wouldn't be a juvenile delinquent anymore. I'd turn my life around. And I pretty much did, all because of the military. As scary as it was.
How were your relationships with your father and your mother upon your return after that first tour?
Mother was excellent. Father was warm to the touch.
Did you and him have a better understanding of each other? Like you now were both veterans of a war, and there was an understanding of that. That's a different understanding than most civilians have.
I think I did. I'm not really sure that he did, though. Again, because all he got to hear were baby killers and druggies. So, I tried to tell him, my unit didn't do that. The military didn't do that until later on in Vietnam. So when we kind of dropped it at that.
As you look back at that first tour, did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy the work?
No.
Which is interesting. I'm glad you say that, because you re-enlisted, which I find very interesting. So what led you in the time after 67 to re-enlisting and going back for a second tour? That's a very interesting time frame. If you didn't enjoy it the first tour, how did your life shift where you said, I'm going to go back?
I moved in with my cousin after my ex-wife divorced me. I moved in with my cousin, and I lived with him for about 3 months. And I decided that I was going to go back. I was going to re-enlist again, and I did re-enlist, and I told them I wanted to go to Germany, and that's where I went. And pretty soon Germany, we were always taught that Germany was good guest houses, good food, good girls, good beer. And it was, and that lasted for a little while, but then the vacation was over, and we would go out to like Baumholder, midwinter, freezing, and we would spend 2 weeks there for field training. And all we would do is we didn't have any blanks for our weapons, so they just made us yell as loud as we could, bang, bang. And I finally went into the commander in Germany, and I said, I've already done the real shit, the real stuff. I don't want to play bang bang anymore. So I thought about it, and I volunteered to go back to Vietnam. But because I was one of the early soldiers in Vietnam, not many of them were that were re-enlisted and stayed in the service. I think I was the only one in our battalion, and I was treated kind of like Audie Murphy, hot commodity, a year in Vietnam, infantry, and E5. That was my pay grade. So I sat for a while, and then I started to drink again. One night I remember I went out and got so drunk, I came back, I laid in my bed, I had a cigarette. The cigarette started the mattress smoldering, and I woke up the next day, and I was wet and black. The mattress was wet and black, and my friends just made the fire out and went back to bed. I never heard anything more about it, so I don't know if anything came about it. But then I laid there and I thought, no, I want to go back to Vietnam. I want to go back as an advisor to the Vietnamese. I thought this was one sure way that I could help them. And I put in my transfer, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks went by, a month went by, and I wasn't hearing anything. So I asked my first sergeant, I said, I wonder what happened. And he said, I don't know, we haven't heard anything. So I did what I told all my trainees to never do, write your congressman. So I did, and it didn't take long. Along came a letter from Congressman Zablocki saying, you know, I appreciate your willingness to go back to Vietnam. Thank you for your service. As soon as you clear the post, you're free to go. So the company commander had that same letter, and so did first sergeants. They just said, you know, we don't know what happened. And I think they stuffed it under the paperwork in the desk again, because, you know, I'm a hot commodity. They don't want to lose you. So I got a 15-day leave out of it, and I went home, and I was looking forward to Vietnam because I thought I was really, really going to help. And I had 15 days at home. I met a girl. We spent all of our time together. And before that, I said I would never let anyone on a runway anymore crying. And I broke that rule because I left her there crying. I got to Saigon, Vietnam, and they put me up in a hotel in Saigon for 2 days until my unit came and got me. And I would lay in the bed in that hotel room and listening to that old fan chugging on the ceiling, and I could hear all the artillery. You could see all the bombs, the white flares coming up. And then my unit came to pick me up, and I was in Gia Dinh province. Tu Duc was the district. And we stayed at the Vietnamese infantry school.
Let's pause. Let's bookmark that, because I think we've passed over some things. I want to come back to Tu Duc. So it's a good bookmark to have. You said that in Germany you started to drink again. Did you have a history of drinking after your first tour? Was that where you guys didn't know it back at that time, but having PTS from those experiences in combat, did it come out in drinking between the two tours?
Yes.
And we're going to loop back to that later, because you have an experience later on where you said you swore off alcohol. And so I just wanted to label that, like there was a history here of that. Do you know how many times in that first tour you were in contact? How often you were in contact in that first tour?
Probably 20, 25, maybe 30.
25 to 30 times that you were in combat the first year in Vietnam?
Yes.
So you land back in Saigon, you're laying there, you hear all of this happening. When you got back to Vietnam and your first night there, was you had this new mission, this new purpose of I'm going to help the Vietnamese going through, was it Mac V?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but hearing all of the bombs or different things going on outside that window, did you did you think at any point, oh, I made a mistake, I didn't want to come back here, or was there a familiarity to it?
There was a familiarity, and I didn't then, and I don't now think I made a mistake by going back.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that I'm going to live with the Vietnamese. I'm going to go out on patrol with the Vietnamese. And that was what they call RFPF, Regional Forces. It's like our Army Reserves.
Mm-hmm.
And they would live in that village, and we would go out on patrols with them, or take a helicopter, and they would fly us into a hamlet where we'd spend the night with them. So I don't think I don't see anything that scares me yet. I hear the normal sounds of war, but nothing that's going to harm me yet.
This is interesting because it's a flip. If you go back to before you went to Vietnam the first time and just your feelings about the Vietnamese, then how they changed with you seeing the young soldier, do you feel like part of your desire, your new mission in wanting to help the Vietnamese sort of stemmed from that finding that mutual understanding in seeing that younger soldier?
Yes, because I was an advisor. I was there to help them. I wasn't originally there to kill them,
Mm-hmm.
to kill the VC. That was up to the Vietnamese. I would tell them how to do it. I would show them how to do it, and then they would do it. I wouldn't have to.
And I want to touch on something, that 15-day leave that you had in Milwaukee. You had a friend, Jerome
Litke, yes.
Litke.
Him and I went to school. His parents are the one that had the tavern. He joined the Marines, and I don't remember how I got word, but I got word that he was on his way back to Milwaukee in a body bag for his funeral. And that really bothered me because I knew Jerry very well. And I knew his parents and his sister. His sister and I, up until about a year ago, was still writing one another. And it was hard. He was all like they do now. He was all dressed in his uniform, looking really, really sharp, not coming out of that coffin.
I'm sure you had friends killed in combat, killed in action in your first tour.
No one, Army friends, nobody from my hometown.
So how was Jerry's death different from you? And did you at that point, did you have any second thoughts about going back to Vietnam?
No. He went and joined the Marines to do a job, and he knew, what the consequences were. It's just looking down at somebody in a coffin that kind of shakes you up. Mm-hmm. And that's what it did to me. I had friends in Vietnam, Army military brothers that were killed, but that was different. I don't know if I talk about that, but on my cane, I write, I don't know what I wrote. It's nothing. Yeah, it's nothing. What now, honey? Yeah, it ain't nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's I think how all of us felt. We couldn't dwell on it. We had to get them up into a chopper or a body bag and let them go. And we had to move on. And that's what we did. And when we were back in the tent area, then that's time to talk about them and time to mourn them. but it wasn't out in the field.
Speaking of friends, at this point when you're back in Saigon for your second tour, where was George Marinich?
George, he left when I was still in Vietnam. He left, and I talk about this too.
In your memoir,
he was leaving, and he was waiting on the helicopter to pick him up. And he came over and we were talking, and he said, I swear to you, when you get back and I get back, we're going to go back to that snack bar, and we're going to have coffee, and we're going to talk, and we're going to laugh. I always knew he would do this. He re-enlisted in the Army, went to Texas, went to Germany, met his wife, and I talked to her 2-3 years ago. Met her, and he got assigned to Texas. He also made first sergeant, but then he died of cancer. I spent I don't know how many years looking for George. I finally sat down and called every Marinich I could find in Milwaukee, and I found someone who said, George, yeah, I think I had a nephew in Vietnam. And then he went to Texas, but he died of a cancer or something. And he said, I'll tell you what, if I ever hear from his wife or his son again, I'll have them call you. And the son did. And yeah, he did go to Texas. And yeah, he did die. And yeah, he disappointed me because we hugged each other so tight as he was getting onto that helicopter, and we promised one another we'd meet again. And I think we will in God's heaven somewhere. I'm going to see George again. I miss him.
No doubt. Back into Saigon, we're in 68. You're about to go to Tu Duc?
You go to the unit. Yeah, they came and picked me up. And again, we went to a hamlet called Tu Duc. In the hamlet was the infantry school, Vietnamese infantry school, and that's where we lived. And that made me feel a lot better. At night, when we would come back, we'd go to dinner, and then they would have movies in the bar and a restaurant. And we could do that every night if we wanted to. Mm-hmm. Some of us had to go to the TOC center in the village and monitor the radios, monitor the Vietnamese. So I got to do that. I don't want to jump too far ahead here. So I got to do that. Then we would go back to the infantry school. We'd take a nap and we'd get up again, and we would sit and we'd talk. If we had a mission to go on, we would go on. Some of those missions lasted overnight in a village, and that scared me because I didn't know who you could trust in that village. Mm-hmm. We would go out on ambushes with them, teach them tactics, teach them infantry tactics.
Did you feel like you were helping?
Yes. First I did, yeah.
Now you say at first you did, eventually you felt like it wasn't helping?
Yes.
Why is that?
Yeah. Our intelligence officer and I were going to downtown Gia Dinh province. We were in a Jeep, he was driving, and all of the Jeeps there had a safety strap so that you wouldn't roll out of the Jeep. Well, he said he heard gunfire, so he jerked the wheel quick to the right, and because I wasn't belted in, I tumbled out. My left foot stayed in the Jeep, and he dragged me about 100, 150 feet, and then turned down a side street to try to get away from the firing. And it ended up that there were no firing. It was just backfire of a car.
Hmm.
So I ended up going to the hospital. I got a full hard cast on my left leg. And I also got TOC duty every night, TOC, Tactical Operations Center.
Mm-hmm.
This is when I started to change. The Vietnamese would fall asleep every night. None of the Vietnamese, you can yell at them, you can tell them, but then it just goes off again like it was a lot of fun. And I often thought, well, how do I know he's not a VC? How do I know that they're not attacking us because he's already there and he told them? How do you know that stuff? Yeah. And it seems they got kind of lackadaisy, depending on the Americans too much.
So you spent some time in a cast after that Jeep accident. How
Yes.
long were you in a cast?
30 days.
What did you do during that time?
I managed the TOC every night.
So specifically, like, what was the job duty?
The TOC was made out of storage containers.
Okay.
The shipment storage containers.
Mm-hmm.
In there, I would have a radio. They would have a radio to all of their units. And we would just sit and we'd monitor the radios. And if something occurred, I'd get on mine and call my unit. They would supposedly get on theirs and call their unit. But again, I don't think that happened because they were all falling asleep.
Did I guess it was your girlfriend now at this point, your parents, did you still get letters from them?
My parents, yes. Her, no.
Was she somebody that you stayed with after that tour? Did you go back to her?
Oh, yes. I went back to her when we got married. Unfortunately, she was killed in a car accident 6 years later, I think.
In the mid-70s?
Yeah. But she did write, and her parents wrote, my parents wrote. And what was even better is back then you could take little reel-to-reel discs and you could send your voice on the reel. Mm-hmm. And she would do the same thing back and forth.
Overall, how would you compare your second tour to your first tour? Obviously better. Less, yeah, I was going to say probably better. Can you sort of elaborate on that?
It was better because I didn't see one kid laying on the ground with one eye and no brain my second year.
Yeah.
I didn't see any of my friends die the second year. It was, I think, more relaxed than it should have been, but we were in the middle of a ranger school with tons of Vietnamese rangers. Mm-hmm. So I felt pretty safe.
At the end of this tour in '69, you come back to the United States. Was this return home different than the first time you returned home?
No, I think it was, as far as my relatives go, I think it was the same. They were happy to see me. Mm-hmm. But by then, I think the riots in Washington had picked up quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So I didn't bring up Vietnam. We didn't talk about Vietnam. We just let it go. I called my Army friend once and I asked him a question, and he said, "I forgot about Vietnam years and years ago." And that, to the extent that a lot of them did.
Which is hard. That was such a big part of your life. And as you mentioned that you were in Germany, they didn't want you to leave because you were the one with the experience. And I'm sure that to you, did it feel like to you that uh, a level of importance? Did it feel like you were needed there? Very different from how you went into the Army, in
Yes.
feeling like you could end up in jail if you don't go to the Army.
Yes. When I first got there, the battalion commander, uh, rather than hold each company in a training style missions, he would send all the companies to the theater, and I would teach all through the whole battalion infantry tactics, patrol tactics. So I knew I was needed. I knew they wanted me.
Mm-hmm. When you got back the second time, what did you feel like? We talked about how you had changed as a person after that first tour. How did you change after the second tour?
I think I grew up even more.
Mm-hmm.
I think I respected people more.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't steal anything anymore. I wasn't a juvenile. I had grown up,
Mm-hmm.
and that was my start to my new life.
And how was that new life? What did it look like?
Let's see, we were married. This gets a little rough.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I got married. We had 2 children. She gets killed in a car accident, and I start drinking heavily again.
How
For
old
the
were the kids whenever she was killed in the motors? The accident.
5 years and 3 years. And so I started drinking again and started drinking a lot. And then I met my current wife now, and we were happy. And I don't know if, I think both of us often said that she may have been a replacement for my first wife. I don't know that. I don't think that, because I loved her very much.
Mm-hmm.
But she got tired of being home 24/7 with the children. She had a daughter also. And she began to resent them, and they resented her,
Mm-hmm.
because I would be out getting drunk. She would find me on the grass in the front of the house in the morning, drunk, passed out. She took a garden hose to wake me up. Uh, and it was really a bad time for me. At that time, I went back into the reserves, Desert Storm, I think.
Well, did
And,
you allow me to interrupt? I'm sorry. Did you feel like it was because of the PTS that you had from your tours, or do you think it was also part of like the transition of coming back to civilian life, losing your wife? There was a lot of things that sort of drove you to drink. Is that just sort of what you found comfort in?
well, it helped.
Yeah.
Uh, I think PTSD played an awful lot
Mm-hmm.
into it, though. I couldn't I couldn't really talk to anybody, Most people didn't didn't know about Vietnam, didn't concern themselves about Vietnam. So I had nobody to talk to except Fifth Bacardi.
Were you angry about that?
Yes.
Has that anger subsided?
Yes, only because I'm now talking to a counselor from the VA every couple of weeks. He'll call me to see how I'm doing,
Mm-hmm.
and I can tell him what I'm feeling.
Mm-hmm. At what point did you have this run-in with the police?
Uh, that's with my current wife. I I was drinking on a 3-day binge, and I got home and I went into the basement and I started to play music, old time music, Elvis Presley, that kind of thing. And I was getting very belligerent. I was turning over the pool table. I was blasting the music. So my wife, I think the way it went is her sister called the Brown Deer Police Department. They knew I had a rifle souvenir. So they surrounded the house, and kept trying to talk me into coming out, and I wouldn't come out.
Mhm.
Then they called my dad, and my dad came down. And I said, well, if he comes down, I'll come out. And he came down, he drove down, and him and I got into a car and went to his home, and that was the end of the story.
And what out of that you decided to stop drinking? Was that your sort of realization?
Pretty close to that, yes.
Yeah,
And my wife said, if you don't stop, I'm leaving.
that
So
too.
I remember it was Thanksgiving, 1985, I think. I was sitting all alone at work, and I had a bottle of rum, and I was drinking. And then for some reason, whatever reason, it hit me that she said she's going to leave you if you don't quit drinking. So I stopped drinking that day, and I think that's 35 or 36 years later, and I haven't drank at all.
I find it interesting that your dad came down and you got in the car with him. Did he help to de-escalate the situation? As we said earlier, you maybe had a little bit more of an understanding, both being veterans. Was there something of a new relationship that kind of came out of?
I don't think so. I think what happened is he showed up.
Hmm.
I don't think he felt any different.
Well,
He just,
it's a big deal that he showed up in any case.
yeah, he just thought, all them police surrounding my house,
Mm-hmm.
he should do what he could do. They called my boss, and my boss said, I don't want to get involved in it.
Yeah. So at what point did you become a drill instructor? Because this is now, you've been back after your second tour, you've gone through this experience. Where did your life with the military come up next? West Point, ROTC, drill instructor, these are all sort of roles that you took on.
Before my wife died, I wrote Washington from Vietnam, and they were going to send me to Fort Carson, Colorado, to a mechanized infantry unit. Mm-hmm. And I wrote him, and I said, can I stay here as a door gunner then for 6 months? And they said, no, you can't do that. You waited too long. And I said, well, what about a drill sergeant? Who better to teach these young kids than someone who's had 2 tours in Vietnam? Mm-hmm. They agreed, sent me new orders to report to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Then Fort Campbell, Kentucky, my wife and I get married. Fort Campbell, Kentucky. From there, I went to the drill sergeant school in South Carolina. And that was, I think, 6 or 7 weeks long. Mm-hmm. And I finished the drill sergeant school, and it was a really, really, really hard course. I did the 8th Infantry Academy in Germany, and the drill sergeant school was so much worse than that. I would sit in the latrine studying at night, wondering, am I going to be able to cross that stage and get my brown ground? And yes, eventually I did. And I went back to my unit at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And that's one of the things I think about my military service I enjoyed the most.
It's 12:30.
You enjoyed being a drill sergeant. Why did you enjoy it?
Because I was getting troops ready to go to Vietnam. I knew they were all going. It was 69. Mm-hmm. So I knew they were all going. And it was something to see, and I think there's some letters in my memoir or whatever you have from a mother and a girlfriend telling me how much their sons and boyfriends have changed just from being in basic training with me. And they thanked me for it. And that really made me feel good.
Do you think it was this? Do you look back on your time at basic and who was your drill instructor then, who sort of set you right?
I don't know that he did that. I can't even remember who he was.
Hmm.
I remember doing a lot of scrubbing the pillars on our buildings with toothbrushes, getting them clean. But everyone did that. I think it was all part of basic training.
Being a drill instructor means that you are a mentor, you're a leader. Did you feel like you had to grow those skills through your time in the military? Is it something that was difficult for you to take on that role?
I don't think so. I think I really felt going right into it that
Yeah.
this was something I was really going to enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Did Vietnam help me, prepare me for this? Yeah, I think so.
You ask a pretty serious question in your memoir. You say, "Who will give us back our youth?"
I still say that.
Do you?
I still say that somewhere in a jungle in Vietnam, blood on the ground is my youth. I think we went to Vietnam, or I went to Vietnam as a young kid, and I came back as a very old man. And I think I did that because I saw so many things that the average person will not see in their lifetime. And I think a lot of Vietnam vets feel that way. You know, we were old before our time.
And yet you appreciate your time in the military. And would you do it again?
Yes.
It's a very interesting thought. And I'm not a veteran. I never served in the military, but it's interesting to hear the breadth of your service, the ups, the downs, the difficult times, PTS, all of this, feeling like you lost your youth, but also in the same breath feeling like what you did meant something, that you would do it over again.
Yes.
I find that very interesting when I talk to veterans, that same thought. And I how do you reconcile that in your head of like, there are the bits of this that are so difficult or I hate it, but there is the love of what I love of it and what I did as well.
Well, I feel now that the military was very good for me.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I walked out of that jungle a very old man, but I've had so many interesting, good things happen to me in the military, you know, with ROTC and West Point and all that, that I've kind of put the old man coming out of the jungle on the back burner.
Mm. Can you talk a bit about that, being an instructor at West Point and being an ROTC instructor? This was an evolution for you, your continued sort of service, your continued mentorship and teaching. Can you talk about what it meant to be an instructor at West Point and the ROTC?
We backed up just a little bit. I was in the reserves. My wife dies. I spend every reserve meeting in the tavern across the street. My people in my company made excuses for me, and everyone overlooked what I was doing until in 1978 they finally discharged me. So I went back in 1990, I think, and I was going to show my superiors that I hadn't left my military, my feelings on it. And I started to run for drill sergeant of the year. I came in second place for that. I was awarded the Major Richard Long Award from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And from there, my unit said, well, we're looking for people to go to West Point. And I was really excited. I knew it was going to be very, very hard, though, because you had to go in front of these murder, what they call murder boards, and teach what you were going to teach at West Point. I think West Point has to go neck and neck with being a drill sergeant because of the history at West Point. There is so much history there, and it was such an honor to be one of 40 people to teach there. And then what happened was I was made best instructor at West Point. So they asked me if I would be interested in running that detail. And I said, yeah, of course. So I did that, I think, for the next 4 years until we lost that assignment. But I did that. I ran the unit, I picked the NCOs that were going to do it. I picked the officers that were going to do it. And highly motivated people. And I got to be part of that. Came back, and I was in the G3 division headquarters at the time. And they said, well, we want to try something. Can the reserves in their 4-hour weekly drills teach at Marquette University ROTC? So we said we could, and we moved our schedules around so that we could go to Marquette for 8 hours and teach classes that day. And it worked out very well because we kept doing that for 3-4 years, I think. And then my time was getting near to retire. So I spent the next, I think, 2 years or 3 years going to Marquette, going out to Fort McCoy with them for no pay, just going out there because I enjoyed teaching the kids. So that's how I finished up my military career.
Such a long history of service. What was it like to leave the Army? Did you regret leaving?
I had to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I regretted it. Yeah. I was 60 years old, I think.
So it was time.
Yeah.
Was that a difficult transition?
Yes.
How so?
I felt like I didn't have the same purpose I had at West Point, at ROTC, in Vietnam. Now I had a new purpose.
You wrote a memoir called My Recurring Dream.
Yes.
You thanked 2 gentlemen specifically near the beginning, Major General Litinsky?
Litinsky and Colonel
Stell?
Brian Staley.
Staley. Colonel Staley.
HLE.
Can you tell me about the 2 of them? Specifically, since you thanked them, I thought it might be interesting to hear what they meant to you.
They're my heroes. They've always been. When we go out to Fort McCoy, I always took my own military vehicle because I didn't want to sleep outside, and they knew I was old, so they let me do it. But in the middle of the night, Major, who was I think a first lieutenant at the time, would come and sit in my Humvee, and I would tell him my stories, my Vietnam stories, and my military career. And he kept saying, you need to put this in writing somewhere. You need to leave this so people can read it. And Colonel Staley did the same thing. And Major General invited me to his, although I couldn't go, invited me to his last 3-star when he made 2-star. He invited me to his formation, his award ceremony, but I couldn't go. And they've been friends. They've been good friends ever since. If I ever have a problem, I know I can call them.
Did you feel like writing your memoir helped you to heal a bit? Was it therapy in a way?
Yes. And everyone told me it would be. I don't know. I wasn't ready to put it on paper.
Mm-hmm. What sort of forced you to do that?
My wife and I have been married for 47 years. In between my wife and I are 3 pillows that have been there since the day we got married. And they're there so that when I have violent dreams, I don't want to hurt her. Mm-hmm. And I still have some pretty violent dreams. It all goes back to the kid with the one eye. Mm-hmm. He was always trying to get me to pull him out of this black hole. And I turned around towards the end before I started to write this. I said, I think I'm figuring out my reoccurring dream. He's not. He doesn't want me to pull him out. He wants to pull me in. And I think that was the turning point when I started to talk about Vietnam, write about Vietnam. In 2006, I was watching the movie, the music video with Big and Rich. Mm-hmm. And it was called The 8th of November. It was about a battle that the 173rd had on the 8th of November. Big and Rich even took some of the military back to Vietnam to talk about it. Hmm. And I don't know why, but I bet you I watched that video 20 times in a row. And for some reason, I just snapped. I felt myself going way, way out of control. Mm-hmm. So I made it to the vet center, and the vet center said, "You need to get to the VA emergency room." So they wanted to take me, and I said, "No, I can drive myself." So I got to VA, and they said, "Well, we recommend that you go into the hospital for observation." And I thought to myself, why didn't you do that in 1972? Maybe I wouldn't be where I'm at. Yeah. So they called my wife, and I promised them I would go back on Monday. But I wouldn't let them lock me up, Mm-hmm. They messing with my mind for so long. I didn't want to do that anymore. Yeah. So my wife came and she picked me up. And eventually I started to go to the VA and talk to the psychiatrists and the counselors. But I never got anything out of it. Last time they thought maybe a civilian counselor would help. Mm-hmm. So I went to her, and we spent the time drinking the Starbucks coffee that I bought for her and I, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the ceiling tiles, because I didn't talk and she didn't say anything. Mm-hmm. So I think it was just a waste of time. I do a lot of pills now, medicine. I do that, and that seems to help. I told the last guy, I know that there are cognitive treatment, something about cognitive reliving your past or something. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm 76 years old. I don't have that much left to start screwing around with my head. Let me do it on my own. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm doing.
I'm sure we could go into a lot more, but I want to finish up with just this thought, because, like I said, you've just had this very long history of service, just where you started when you first enlisted, through 2 tours, your time with West Point and JROTC and a drill instructor, and so it's commendable. If you could go back to the Roger who was 16 standing in front of that judge, what would you tell him?
Thank you.
Really? Wow. Why?
It's because of him that I ended up in the service.
Well, I should be more specific then. What would you tell your younger self?
Grow up. Grow up.
That would be your advice for young Roger?
Yeah, stop your stealing, stop your juvenile delinquency, stop your trying to steal cars, stop you stealing watches and giving it to your brother so he likes you. That didn't help anybody. He didn't like me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't like me any less. Young Roger had a lot of things to learn.
It certainly seems like you learned them.
I did. And I'm proud of that, because I think I did most of that on my own.
Mm-hmm. Roger, I want to thank you for your time today, and thank you for your story. Like I said, I feel like in a lot of ways we've only scratched the surface. There was, 2 tours. 2 tours is 1 tour more than most people did, and a lot more than a lot. So there were I'm sure there's certainly stories through that first tour, and many stories with the MAC-V that we could elaborate on.
Village chief, before I left, had a dinner party for me, and he gave me a French Moss 1936 rifle and a Vietnamese Medal honor. And there were some of us, we were sitting there, and my intelligence officer was sitting next to me. And he said, the interpreter said, okay, now we're going to eat. So he put this, I think I wrote that in there. So he put this plate in front of me with this metal thing on top to keep it warm. And I took the metal thing off on top, and there were 2 baby chicks.
Mm.
And I said, I can't eat that. And the interpreter said, you have to eat it. You'll be offended if you don't. So until today, I still can feel the crunching of them bones in my mouth. So there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about. Some funny and some not so funny.
Yeah. Well, Roger, I want to thank you for joining me for the Veterans History Project. Thank you for your years of service, for your sacrifices, and thank you for my freedom, and welcome home.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this. I said, writing my letters, I said, anyone that wants a copy of this, I'll give it to them. Read it,
Mm-hmm.
The young veterans need to know this.
Well, certainly we will, when we post this interview, we'll have a link to that memoir so people can read, get a little bit more of your story from that. We're happy to include that. And we just want to thank you again for being a part of this. And, we will certainly hope to have you a part of our Veterans Breakfast Club community more often, and get to share more stories and hear more stories.
You will. Again, thanks, Sean.
Thank you.